You are standing at an anti-aircraft position on the upper deck of the largest battleship in European history. Minus 18 degrees Celsius. The metal under your hands is too cold to grip without gloves. The sun has not risen above the mountains surrounding Fjord in 7 weeks, and will not rise again for 3 more. Around you, black fjord water, black mountains, black sky, and the ship lit by her own working lights, sitting exactly where she sat yesterday and the day before, and 300 days before that. The guns are behind you. 8 15-inch barrels, each capable of sending an 800-kilogram shell 36 kilometers. They are pointed at nothing. They have been pointed at nothing for nearly 3 years. The last time they fired at an enemy, the only time they fired at an enemy, it was a weather station on Spitsbergen. The weather station did not shoot back. This is not a bad day on Tirpitz. This is a normal one. Tirpitz, 42,900 tons, 8 15-inch guns, a belt of 320 millimeters of hardened steel, a crew of 2,600 men, spent nearly 3 years at anchor in the Arctic fjords of Norway, maintaining weapons her command had decided never to use. When she finally died, on the 12th of November, 1944, capsized by bombs in the waters of Tromsø Fjord, between 950 and 1,200 of her men drowned inside the hull, in water a few degrees above freezing, 60 miles inside the Arctic Circle. In the entire war, she never once engaged an enemy warship, but she destroyed 24 merchant ships out of 35, without firing a single shot and without leaving her anchorage. Not the recruiting version, the real one. What it actually meant to serve inside the most powerful and most useless battleship of the Second World War. Stay until the end? Because what happened to the men inside the overturned hull after the ship rolled over is a detail the official record wrote down in one sentence and never returned to. Start with the ship, because her physical reality determined everything that happened to the people inside her, with the same directness with which a submarine's pressure hull determines the life of a submariner, only at a scale that would have seemed urban to any submariner alive. Tirpitz measured 251 meters from stem to stern, 823 feet, roughly 2.5 city blocks. Beam 36 meters. 12 Wagner high-pressure boilers fed 3 geared steam turbines generating 163,000 horsepower. Maximum speed 30.8 knots, faster than almost anything she was likely to encounter in open water. Her armament was designed for a single purpose, destroying enemy battleships in gun duels at ranges only a battleship could sustain. Main battery, 8 38-centimeter guns in 4 twin turrets, Anton and Bruno forward, Caesar and Dora aft. Each fired an 800-kilogram shell 36 kilometers. Her armor was calculated to survive hits from the same caliber she carried herself. Belt, 320 millimeters. Turret faces, 360. Conning tower, up to 350. If you stood inside that armor, the ship could absorb a hit from most guns on the planet and keep fighting. But every ton of that armor required proportional increases in hull, propulsion, fuel, and the number of men needed to keep the machine operational. A crew of 2,600 was not an arbitrary figure. It was the minimum the designers determined was necessary to run a machine of this size and complexity. Every one of those men existed in the space left over after the armor. Guns, machinery, ammunition, and fuel had claimed theirs. The men were the variable that was adjusted to make the mathematics work, and it was adjusted toward less comfort, not more space. Tirpitz carried more than 7,700 tons of fuel oil, enough range for 8,870 nautical miles at 19 knots. That volume occupied a space comparable to a small building, distributed through tanks along both sides of the hull and below the waterline. The main battery magazine, Shells and propellant charges for 8 15-inch guns was stored directly beneath the turrets, in spaces that were among the most heavily armored on the ship and among the most dangerous to anyone working near them. A magazine detonation meant the end of the ship, and every rating who passed the marking indicating the magazine perimeter knew this not from a safety briefing, but from knowing what had happened to Hood in May of '41. When a single shell from Bismarck reached a magazine, and the largest warship in the Royal Navy ceased to exist in 3 minutes, taking 1,415 of her 1,418 crew with her. Tirpitz was the sister of the ship that had fired that shell. The men who served on her lived alongside magazines containing ammunition of the same caliber, and they knew what had happened when an equivalent magazine on an equivalent ship had detonated. The knowledge was not abstract. It was architectural, built into the geometry of the space in which they existed. The enlisted berthing compartments were forward and aft of the central armored citadel, bunks in 3 tiers on pipe frames. The passage between rows. 2 men could not pass without turning sideways. Officers had cabins with doors that closed. 2,500 ratings lived in open bays where personal space was defined by the perimeter of a bunk and a footlocker. The Wilhelmshaven yard had designed these spaces for a ship in motion. Ventilation assumed running machinery. Heating assumed boilers at operating pressure. A ship at anchor, with boilers at reduced readiness, generated substantially less of its own heat. Fjord, where Tirpitz spent most of her time from the spring of 1943, sits above the 70th parallel, 2 degrees inside the Arctic Circle, roughly the latitude of northern Alaska. -10 to -25 Celsius in winter. The fjord water barely above freezing. Meters of snow on the mountains until April. And the polar night. From the end of November to the end of January, the sun does not clear the horizon. Not the gray German winter of shortened days. Total darkness, in which the morning watch and the night watch are distinguished only by the clock. 2 months. The mountains surrounding the fjord are visible only in moonlight when there is moon. The men who came from Kiel and Bremen knew winter. They did not know this. Cold on the open deck made unprotected metal painful to touch. 20 minutes of outdoor work in standard uniform was a medical risk. Inside the hull, steel bulkheads conducted the temperature of the seawater into the forward berthing compartments where the junior ratings slept, while the machinery spaces at full power exceeded 55 degrees Celsius. Rations, bread, meat, potatoes, tinned goods, coffee, planned for a ship that puts into port and takes on fresh provisions with regularity. A ship anchored in a fjord above the Arctic Circle, months without a major port call, receives supplies through the occupation force logistics system in Norway, a system that by '43 was experiencing the same disruptions as all German logistics at extended range. Fresh food limited, monotony constant, hot water for washing issued by watch rotation, in winter in spaces without separate heating, where undressing was an act of will. The daily routine was built around the assumption that readiness had to be maintained. Anti-aircraft watches, continuous. Torpedo nets, regular maintenance. Anti-submarine defenses, booms, patrol craft. Shore observation posts. The machinery, scheduled maintenance that does not pause because the ship is not moving. Between these tasks, hours of time every day for 2,500 men in a place that was not a port and had none of the infrastructure a port implies. The Kriegsmarine's response to the problem of keeping 2,500 men psychologically functional in an Arctic fjord was the response military bureaucracies produce when they have correctly identified a problem they cannot solve at its root. They organized activities, sports on deck, amateur theatricals, educational programs, a ship's newspaper. Commander Karl Topp sent working parties ashore to cut timber for camouflage netting. not because the camouflage required that method, but because shore work gave men's bodies something to do. Shore leave existed, but the nearest settlement was Alta, a small Norwegian town where interaction with the local population was governed by the specific social constraints that an occupation authority imposed on contact between German military personnel and Norwegians. This was not Liberty in Brest or Wilhelmshaven, not a port with the infrastructure for 2,500 men seeking relief. This was a fjord, mountains, and a small town in which you were the occupier. The ship's medical service covered 2,500 men in conditions that were simultaneously safe. There were no combat casualties, and chronically unhealthy. Colds, respiratory illness, skin infections made inevitable by crowding and limited hygiene. Serious cases required evacuation to Alta, a procedure that in winter was a logistical exercise, not a routine decision. But no medical report could record what was happening to men at the level that military medicine in 43 had no terminology for. The cumulative effect of months of isolation, inaction, waiting, and polar darkness on men whose professional function implied action they were systematically not permitted to take. None of these methods addressed the fundamental problem. These men were soldiers assigned to a weapon they were not permitted to use. One crew member who gave testimony after the war described looking at the 15-inch gun barrels and trying to imagine them firing, and finding that the imagining was entirely abstract, that the guns existed in the context of the fjord as pieces of steel requiring maintenance rather than as weapons with targets. But what the crew feared most did not come from the sea and did not come from the air. It came from underneath, on a boat 15 meters long, crewed by 4 men. Before the attack, the strategy that put these men in the fjords has to be understood, because without it, why the most powerful ship in Europe spent 3 years at anchor while her crew deteriorated has no answer. The strategy is called fleet in being. The theory is straightforward. A powerful force does not need to fight to exert strategic influence. Its existence and the threat that it might act compels an enemy to maintain forces in response, forces that could otherwise be used elsewhere. Fleet in being does not need to leave harbor. It needs to be present, capable, and real enough that the enemy cannot ignore it. Tirpitz was the most successful implementation of fleet in being strategy in the history of naval warfare. That success was achieved entirely at the expense of the men who served on her. Imagine being told, you will serve on a battleship. You picture gun duels, white bow waves, combat operations. You get the most powerful ship in Europe, and you are anchored in an Arctic fjord for 3 years. That is what the German naval staff's calculation meant, translated into human language. The calculation worked. The result was measurable, concrete, and cost the lives of men who never saw Tirpitz. Convoy PQ-17 departed Iceland on the 27th of June, 1942. 35 merchant ships carrying tanks and supplies for the Soviet Union, escorted by destroyers and cruisers. On the 4th of July, the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, received intelligence that Tirpitz might be preparing to sortie. The intelligence was ambiguous. It could not confirm that she had put to sea, but could not guarantee she had not. Pound decided on the basis of the worst case. 3 signals between 9:11 p.m. and 9:36 p.m. Cruisers to withdraw to the west, convoy to scatter. Convoy is to scatter. The convoy scattered. The escort withdrew. The merchant ships, stripped of the concentrated anti-aircraft and anti-submarine defense that convoy formation provides, were left alone with German submarines and aircraft in the perpetual Arctic daylight. Tirpitz was at anchor in Altafjord at that moment. She was not even preparing to sortie. 24 of the 35 ships were sunk. 190 merchant sailors were killed. 400 aircraft went to the bottom. 350 tanks, 100,000 tons of material intended for the Soviet Union in the summer of 42, the summer of the German advance toward Stalingrad, on the floor of the Arctic Ocean. Tirpitz destroyed that convoy without firing a shot. The single possibility that she might sortie killed 190 men. Tirpitz had in fact prepared to sortie. Operation Russelsprung. Admiral Schneeven put to sea with Tirpitz, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, and the cruiser Admiral Scheer. But German command, fearing the loss of their last remaining battleship as they had lost Bismarck, recalled the group to the fjord the same day a British submarine made contact and transmitted a sighting report. Tirpitz spent less than 24 hours in open water. By that point, the convoy had already scattered, the escort had already withdrawn, and the merchant ships were already dying individually in Arctic waters that the polar day rendered transparent to German aircraft and submarines. The destruction of PQ-17 was not a side effect. It was the precise result of the strategy for which Tirpitz had been designed as an instrument, a strategy in which a ship produces strategic effect through the bare fact of its existence without any need to fight. That is fleet in being. That is an institutional decision that the strategic value of a ship that does nothing justifies keeping 2,500 men in a condition that is neither combat nor peace nor service in any sense those men understood when they were assigned to a battleship. The effects of PQ-17 extended beyond the shipping losses. Allied convoys to the Soviet Union were suspended until December of 42. Churchill called the loss of PQ-17 one of the most melancholy naval episodes of the entire war. The melancholy was directed at the dead merchant sailors. No one at the time was asking what it did to the crew of Tirpitz to know that their ship had just killed 190 men without leaving her anchorage, not as a weapon, but as a threat. Fuel completed the picture. German surface fleet supply had been constrained from the beginning of the war, and by 43 had become the determinative factor. From March of 43, the fuel shortage explicitly prevented Tirpitz from leaving her anchorage even when tactical circumstances might otherwise have permitted it. Training exercises, the only way to maintain crew proficiency in seamanship and gunnery, were reduced and almost entirely suspended because the fuel they consumed could not be reliably replenished. The engineering crews found themselves in a specific professional absurdity, responsible for maintaining complex high-pressure machinery. At readiness for operations, they had no fuel to demonstrate were possible. They certified readiness they could not prove. The watchstanders logging inspection results understood the gap between the paperwork and the reality. And here is the popular version that needs to be dismantled. Tirpitz is commonly presented as a ship that won without fighting, a strategic masterpiece, a silent weapon that held the Royal Navy in check through sheer existence. That is true for the Admiralty, for the naval staff, for strategy textbooks. For 2,500 men inside the hull, it was a prison in which they were ordered every day to prepare for a battle their own command had decided never to give. A strategic masterpiece from the outside, an institutional betrayal from the inside. The ship that survived all of this was ultimately destroyed, not by an enemy fleet, but by bombs dropped on a target her own command had already officially declared unfit for combat. The first violence came from below. X-craft were British midget submarines, 15 meters long, 4-man crews, designed for a single purpose, to penetrate defended anchorages and destroy ships that the fleet could not attack in open water because those ships never went to open water. Each carried 2 side charges containing 2 tons of amytal apiece. On the 11th of September, 1943, 6 X-craft departed Scotland under tow, 350 miles across the Norwegian Sea. X-9 was lost in transit. Her tow parted, all hands gone. X-8 was scuttled after mechanical failure. The anchorage at Kåfjord had been designed to make penetration impossible. Anti-submarine nets at the entrance, torpedo nets around the ship itself, shore batteries, Patrol craft. On the morning of the 22nd of September, X-6 under Lieutenant Donald Cameron and X-7 under Lieutenant Basil Place cut through the nets and dropped their charges beneath the hull. Both boats were destroyed. X-5 was sunk by Tirpitz's guns before her charges could be placed. Her crew lost. Cameron and Place survived to become prisoners of war and received the Victoria Cross. 8 tons of amatol detonated at 8:52 in the morning. The ship was lifted from the water. Every man aboard felt it not as an explosion heard from a distance, but as a force transmitted through the hull structure into his own body. Simultaneously, from all directions, light bulbs shattered throughout the ship. Equipment was knocked from its mounts. In the machinery spaces, the shock traveled through the structure directly into the mechanisms, causing damage that subsequent inspection over the following days found more extensive than initial assessments had suggested. In the berthing compartments, men were thrown from their bunks. In the turrets, the guns shifted on their training rings. Men standing on deck felt the deck leave them and return, with an impact that traveled through their knees and spine. An 18-meter gash below the waterline, 1,400 tons of water shipped. Turret Dora knocked off her training ring. Her 700-ton structure could no longer rotate. Both Arado floatplanes on the catapult destroyed. 3 of the 4 main turbines temporarily out of action. Fire control systems, main and backup, damaged. A 1-degree list to port that subsequent repair work never fully corrected. Immediate casualties were few. This was not the type of attack that produces mass casualties at the moment of the event, but nobody discussed it. Every man aboard made the same calculation independently, took what had just happened, set it against everything he knew about the war outside the fjord, and understood how thin the margin had been between the ship that had survived and a ship that would not have. It is worth noting that the only time Tirpitz used her main armament against a target that was at least theoretically military was in September of 42, Operation Zitronella, against Norwegian and Allied weather stations and coal installations on Spitsbergen. The invasion force included Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, and 10 destroyers to attack a garrison of fewer than 150 men. Tirpitz shelled the shore installations with her main battery. 8 15-inch guns, each shell costing approximately what an average German worker earned in a year, fired at wooden buildings and radio masts. That was the only combat operation in which the main battery was ever used across the ship's entire career. Spitsbergen, weather stations, wooden buildings. The most powerful battleship in Europe was firing at targets any destroyer could have handled. If you were standing at one of those guns and pulling the trigger, you understood the scale of the mismatch between the instrument and the task, between what you had trained for and what you had ultimately been permitted to do. Tirpitz was out of action for 6 months after the X-craft attack. The only dry dock capable of receiving her, at Saint-Nazaire in France, had been destroyed by a British commando raid in March of 42, destroyed precisely to prevent Tirpitz from reaching the Atlantic. The repairs had to be done in place, in the fjord, in an Arctic winter. On the 3rd of April, 1944, Operation Tungsten, 40 Ferry Barracuda dive bombers, 80 escort fighters, 2 waves. Tirpitz was conducting sea trials, her first in months. German radar detected the aircraft late. Anti-aircraft crews were not fully manned. The escort fighters specifically suppressed the anti-aircraft positions with cannon fire before the bombs came. 10 direct hits. Not one bomb penetrated the armored deck. They were not heavy enough. But 10 bombs detonating on a ship's superstructure and upper deck are not an event without consequence. 122 killed. 329 wounded. Commander Hans Meyer among the wounded. 15% of the reduced crew in a single attack. The men at the anti-aircraft positions, the first targets for the escort fighters, were disproportionately represented among the dead. they were replaced. Those who replaced them stood at the same positions through the rest of that summer, through 4 subsequent air raid alerts: Operations Planet, Brawn, Mascot, and Goodwood. None of those attacks scored hits. The Germans had improved the smokescreen system. Chlorosulfonic acid dispensed from shore-based generators created artificial fog over the entire anchorage within minutes of an alarm. Researchers studying the growth rings of pine trees near the anchorage found evidence of chemical stress at distances up to 3 kilometers. Every alarm cycle left a residue. An alarm triggers physiological mobilization, adrenaline, elevated heart rate, readiness. When the alarm ends without an attack, the body returns to a resting state, but not the same resting state it left. Repeated mobilization cycles without resolution produce a cumulative effect that post-war psychology would describe with clinical precision, but which the men on Tirpitz in '44 experienced without the terminology, as fatigue that sleep did not lift, as alertness that did not switch off after the all-clear, because the body had learned not to trust the all-clear. The winter between Tungsten and the ship's death, the winter of '43 to '44, and then the autumn of '44 after Paravane, was the period in which the men inside the hull lived with specific knowledge. The ship they served on was officially no longer fit for combat. Their command knew it. They knew it, and they were still standing at positions that would be attacked again, because fleet in being doctrine does not end just because the fleet has stopped being. Alarm, smoke, engine sound, guns firing into fog, and silence. The aircraft turned away. The fjord is there. The ship is there. If you are standing at an anti-aircraft position, open deck, no armor, first in the line of contact, you know one specific thing. When the next real attack comes, fighter suppression of the AA positions will be the first action, as it was in Tungsten. Your position is defined by function, not by choice. And the probability that you specifically will be among the casualties is higher than for the men below the armored deck. You stand and wait. Wait for the alarm. Wait for the smoke. Wait for the sound. On the 15th of September, 1944, that cycle ended. Operation Paravane. Lancaster heavy bombers of 9 Squadron and 617th Squadron, the same squadron that had destroyed the Ruhr dams. A new type of bomb, tall boy, 12,000 pounds, 16.5 feet long, designed by Barnes Wallis, the same engineer who created the bouncing bomb. A penetrator. It falls at near sonic speed, stabilizes through spin imparted by its fins, and can penetrate 16 feet of reinforced concrete. Tirpitz's armored deck, between 80 and 120 millimeters, could not stop it. One tall boy struck the bow. The deformation was permanent. Repair was impossible without a dry dock that did not exist. The ship that had been maintained at combat readiness for 3 years, for a sortie that was never ordered, had become a ship whose combat readiness was permanently over. The Kriegsmarine moved her to Tromsø and reclassified her as a floating battery. A sandbank was constructed under the hull to prevent capsizing. The crew was reduced to approximately 1,700 men. The arithmetic that produces a reduction of that kind is not the arithmetic of optimistic planning. The move to Tromsø had an additional consequence that German command either did not fully register or decided to accept. Tromsø was 200 miles closer to the airfields of northern Scotland than Kåfjord. That difference in range meant that Lancaster bombers, which could not reach Kåfjord with a full bomb load and return without refueling, which had required an intermediate stop at Soviet airfields, could now reach Tromsø and return to Scotland on a single load. The move made to increase the ship's protection placed her within range of the weapon that would destroy her. Between Paravane on the 15th of September and Catechism on the 12th of November, 2 months passed. 2 months in which the men aboard lived inside a ship that could not move, could not be repaired, could not escape the next attack, and had been openly reclassified from a warship into a static gun platform. On the 29th of October, another attack was made. Operation Obviate, same squadrons, same tall boys, but cloud cover prevented accurate sighting, and no hits were scored. The crew survived that attack. They knew the next one would come. They did not know when, but they knew it would. And they knew that if the next attack found the conditions Obviate had not provided, clear sky, good visibility, the outcome was one that the design of the tall boy and the current condition of their ship made mathematically inevitable. 29 Lancasters, 18 from 617th Squadron and 13 from 9 Squadron, departed Lossiemouth in northern Scotland before dawn, 2,200 miles over the Norwegian Sea. They arrived over Tromsø at 9:41 in the morning. Conditions: perfect, clear sky, excellent visibility. The smokescreen system either had no hydrogen remaining or was deployed too late. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The guns were manned by men who had stood at those positions through years of alarms and through tungsten 7 months earlier. 2 tall boys, possibly 3, struck the ship within minutes of each other. The first between turrets, Anton and Bruno, it did not detonate, but it punched through the deck. The second between the aircraft catapult and the funnel, it penetrated the armored deck and exploded inside the hull, tearing a hole through the belt armor. A 200-foot gash along the port side. The third, at turret Caesar, started a fire that spread toward the aft magazine. 9:49. 8 minutes after the attack began. The ship is listing to port. The list accelerates. Abandoned ship is ordered. Captain Robert Weber calculated that the shallow water and the constructed sandbank would prevent complete sinking. 9:52. Tirpitz capsized. 18 minutes after the capsizing, with the hull already inverted and men swimming in the near-freezing water of the fjord, the Caesar turret magazine detonated. The 700-ton turret was blown 25 yards into the air. Debris fell on the men in the water. Those who were below deck when the ship capsized were trapped. An inverted steel hull. Water a few degrees above freezing. Complete darkness when the electrical systems failed. Compartments filling with water from the flooding that had caused the capsize. Historian Mark Baker, in his book Buckham's Bombers, published in 2024, records a detail that is impossible to read and set aside. 200 young sailors, locked in crushed compartments inside the inverted hull, were singing in the darkness, in near-freezing water, in air that was growing thinner with each passing hour. They sang until there was nothing left to sing with. Within 2 hours, 596 men had made it to shore or been pulled from the water. Then the second operation began, reaching those still inside the hull. Norwegian and German rescue crews cut through the hull to reach air pockets. The hull of a battleship, designed to resist 15-inch shells, did not yield quickly to acetylene-cutting equipment brought to a Norwegian fjord on an emergency basis. Over 2 days, 87 men were cut free from compartments that had retained air. After that, it was determined that all remaining oxygen in the accessible spaces had been exhausted. Total dead, between 950 and 1,204, depending on the source. British casualties? 0. 1 aircraft damaged. Goebbels' communiqué reported, most of the crew was saved. Of approximately 1,700 men aboard, between 950 and 1,200 died. That was the official version. The last one. The strategic accounting deserves to be made explicit because it requires holding 2 things simultaneously true. Fleet in being strategy worked, and it worked at a cost that no recruiting poster described. Tirpitz, by sitting in the Norwegian fjords for 3 years, compelled the Royal Navy to keep capital ships at Scapa Flow that were needed in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. The total number of separate attacks on Tirpitz during the war exceeded 30, from the Wilhelmshaven bombing raids of 40 and 41 to Catechism in 44. The cost of those attacks in aircraft, crews, fuel, and carrier deployments belongs to Tirpitz's strategic success, a success that was not a success for the men inside. Churchill called her the Beast. She was a predator that killed through existence rather than action, and the measures required to neutralize her consumed more resources than she would have consumed in direct combat. But that accounting was not conducted from inside the hull. The men who lived in the berthing compartments and stood at the anti-aircraft positions were not participants in the strategic calculation. They were the material through which it was executed. Alfred Fassbender, the senior surviving officer of Tirpitz on the 12th of November, left a detailed account of that morning. Historian Mark Baker used it in Buckham's Bombers, published in 2024, one of the most thorough modern studies of the hunt for Tirpitz. Fassbender recorded the facts, where he was when the bomb struck, what he saw, what he did, the sequence of orders, the sequence of hits, first, second, third, the list, the explosion of turret Caesar, debris falling on men in the water. He did not describe what he felt, only what he did. Each action was the difference between being among the 596 who made it to shore and remaining inside. The official record documented the rescue operation as follows. Over 2 days, 87 men were cut from air pockets in the hull. After that, the oxygen in remaining compartments was determined to have been exhausted. Operation concluded. 1 sentence, no return to the subject. But there is a detail that sentence does not contain. While rescuers were cutting through the hull from outside, while acetylene torches worked on armor designed to resist 15-inch shells, from certain compartments there was a sound. 200 young sailors, locked in crushed compartments inside the inverted hull, were singing in the darkness, in water barely above freezing, in air that grew thinner with each passing hour. They sang until there was nothing left to sing with. We do not know what they sang. The documentation did not record it. We know only the fact, the sound heard from outside, and what it said about the men inside, that in the last hours they chose not to be silent. Tirpitz was the most powerful warship in European history. She fired her main guns at the enemy once. She never engaged an enemy warship. She destroyed 24 merchant ships without leaving her anchorage. And she took 1,000 of her crew to the bottom of Tromsø fjord on a November morning, under a communique that told the country most of the crew had been saved. The Kriegsmarine called her the most powerful warship Germany had ever built. They were right. What they did not say, in the personnel documents, in the assessments that sent 2,600 men above the Arctic Circle, was what the power inside that hull would actually be used for, and what it would cost the men they were sending to use it. The documentation recorded the strategic result. The communique said most were saved, and moved on. 200 voices in the darkness did not. If this account gave you something you didn't have before, subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment. Which ship deserves this accounting next? The ships are on the bottom. The men who served on them are almost all gone. What remains is the record of what they actually went through. That is what we make here.